All right, are you ready? We're diving deep into the fight for women's suffrage in the U.S. Buckle up, though. It's a lot more complicated than those old photos, the ones with ladies in sashes and all. We're really going beyond just the surface level this time. We've got some great excerpts from Wondery's American History Tellers podcast.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
It is.
It's really about, well, I'd say it's about understanding the strategy behind it all, the personalities, the just pure resilience that it took to get that 19th Amendment. It was a movement decades in the making. And not everyone agreed on the best way to win, which we'll get into.
Definitely not a united front, huh?
Okay.
So let's rewind a bit. It's the early 1900s. The suffrage movement's already been going on for like 70 years at this point, and women still can't vote in most of the U.S. Things really start heating up, though, as we enter the 1910s.
Absolutely. And by 1917, with World War I raging, it really becomes a defining moment. You have these two powerful figures who emerge, Alice Paul and her National Women's Party. They were known for these really in-your-face tactics, like picketing the White House, calling President Wilson Kaiser Wilson on their banners. Can you imagine?
Wow, that's bold.
Oh, they were not afraid of confrontation.
I bet that ruffled some feathers, especially during wartime.
It definitely did. A lot of controversy, even within the movement itself. Then on the other side, you have Carrie Chapman, Catt,
Okay.
and the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA as it's often called. They took a much more diplomatic route.
Interesting.
They really wanted to prove women's patriotism during the war and hopefully sway public opinion that way.
Okay, so two very different approaches to the same goal. What was the dynamic like between these two factions?
I don't know if dynamic is the right word. There was definitely tension there. The podcast does a great job of showing the friction between, Paul's more militant approach and Catt, who was much more about strategic maneuvering behind the scenes. It's actually a side of the movement that we often don't hear much about.
Yeah, that makes sense. With something so complex and with such high stakes, bound to have some internal conflict, right? So tell me more about these tactics of Paul's. What were these silent sentinels the podcast keeps mentioning?
The silent sentinels. So basically, this group of women would stand silently outside the White House day after day.
Day after day. Wow.
Holding banners with messages demanding suffrage, even criticizing President Wilson pretty directly. Imagine the courage it took to do that, especially with the backlash they faced.
I can't even imagine, yeah. So what kind of backlash are we talking about?
Well, it wasn't just disapproval. You had angry mobs surrounding them, hurling insults. Some even resorted to physical attacks.
Oh.
And despite the fact that they were protesting peacefully, they were often arrested.
Arrested.
On really flimsy charges, obstructing traffic, things like that.
So they were being treated like criminals, basically, instead of citizens just expressing their rights.
Exactly. And even worse, the conditions they had to endure in places like the Occoquan workhouse.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Awful. Absolutely awful. Maggot-infested food. Deplorable sanitation.
Yeah.
I mean, it was clear what they were trying to do, break their spirits and silence their demands.
It's crazy to think that these women were subjected to that kind of treatment simply for demanding the right to vote. But they didn't back down, did they?
Not at all. To protest their treatment, Alice Paul and a lot of the others actually went on hunger strikes while they were imprisoned.
Hunger strikes, wow.
And the response to that? Force feeding.
Oh, God.
And the podcast actually shares some excerpts from smuggled notes, describing the whole thing, the brutality of it, the pain.
That's awful.
It's a really disturbing part of this story.
It's hard to even fathom that level of commitment. But did those extreme measures actually help their cause at all? Or did it just alienate those in power even more?
It might surprise you to hear this, but it actually helped shift public opinion in their favor.
Really?
Yeah. As news spread about the force feeding and the terrible way they were being treated, people started to question the government's whole narrative.
That makes sense.
Were these women really dangerous criminals? Or were they being punished for demanding basic rights? The tides started to turn a bit.
Interesting. So while all this was going on, Carrie Chapman, Catt, and NASA were taking a different approach, right? What were they focused on during this time?
Catt, she was really focused on achieving suffrage at the state level, particularly in New York.
New York.
She understood that winning over the most populous state at the time would be a huge win.
Yeah. Smart.
Both symbolically and strategically.
So what was her strategy? How did it differ from Paul's more confrontational approach?
Well, Catt really believed in meticulous organization, building alliances, demonstrating, women's capabilities and their patriotism, especially during wartime.
Right.
She worked tirelessly, mobilizing women across the state, engaging in traditional lobbying efforts, giving speeches, even enlisting the help of influential men.
Interesting. It's fascinating to see how these two completely different approaches ultimately both contributed to the movement. So, did she manage to pull it off in New York?
She did, and it was a huge turning point. I mean, monumental.
Wow.
In 1917, New York passed a state suffrage referendum granting women the right to vote.
Huge.
It signaled that a federal amendment wasn't just a dream, it was a real possibility.
Right.
It also showed just how effective Catt's behind-the-scenes strategic work could be.
It couldn't have been easy navigating the politics of New York, especially with Tammany Hall and all that.
Oh, you're right. For those who don't know, Tammany Hall was this powerful Democratic political machine in New York City, known for, well, let's just say their influence and their questionable practices.
Yeah, not exactly known for their ethical purity.
But incredibly, Catt actually managed to secure their neutrality on the suffrage issue.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
It really shows her political savvy and her ability to navigate some pretty tricky situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So it seems like both Paul's confrontational tactics and Catt's more strategic maneuvering were starting to make a real impact. But what about President Wilson? Was he finally coming around to the idea of a federal amendment?
Well, Wilson was in a tough spot. Initially, he resisted those calls for a federal amendment.
Makes sense politically.
Yeah, likely for political reasons. But with the suffrage movement gaining momentum and his need for public support during the war, he had to reconsider his stance.
Yeah, I could see that. So it was a combination of public pressure, political strategy, and maybe a little bit of conscience finally pushing him to act. Did he officially endorse the amendment?
He did. In early 1918, Wilson finally came out in support of the federal suffrage amendment.
Okay.
He even gave a speech to Congress, urging them to pass it as a war measure.
So the suffragists now had a powerful ally in the White House.
Exactly. It was a huge victory for them.
It must have felt like a real turning point. With the president on their side, it seemed like victory was within reach. So what happened next? Did Congress finally pass the amendment?
Well, the House of Representatives did approve it, but it was a close one, passing by a single vote.
Wow, can you imagine the tension in that room?
Oh, I bet. But the real battle, they soon learned, was in the Senate.
So even with the president's support and the House's approval, the fight wasn't over. What made the Senate such a hurdle?
Well, the Senate was a lot tougher to crack. The Southern Democrats held a lot of power at the time, and they were largely opposed to suffrage, mostly because they were afraid it would empower black women voters.
So it was about more than just sexism.
Exactly. This became a major roadblock for the movement, led to some really tense moments, even within the suffrage movement itself.
Ah, so those internal conflicts we talked about earlier were starting to resurface as the pressure mounted. Were there any specific incidents that really highlighted this tension?
There was one, pretty dramatic actually. It involved Carrie Chapman Catt and Senator James Wadsworth, who was the chair of the Senate Women's Suffrage Committee.
Okay.
He was notorious for his delaying tactics.
I bet that was frustrating.
Oh, incredibly frustrating for the suffragists after decades of fighting. The podcast describes Catt storming into his office, furious with his inaction and lack of urgency. It's a powerful moment. You can really feel the frustration building within the movement.
Yeah, totally. After decades of fighting, any delay must have felt like an eternity. So what happened next? Did the Senate cave to the pressure? Or did all this internal conflict just derail the movement even further?
It didn't, not right away. You see, it wasn't just about sexism. There were powerful economic forces at play, too.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean?
Well, big businesses, especially those in industries like textiles and manufacturing, they saw women's suffrage as a threat, like a direct threat to their bottom line.
How so?
They were afraid that women, if they could vote, would support things like regulations on working conditions, limits on child labor, increased wages, all things that could cut into their profits, of course.
Ah, I see. So these businesses were actively campaigning against suffrage.
Oh, absolutely. They used their money and influence to lobby politicians, spread anti-suffrage propaganda, even funded these whole opposition groups. It was a pretty well-organized and well-funded campaign, all to protect their own interests.
So with the government and big business against them, what chance did the suffragists really have?
It was a tough battle. And even though Wilson had come out in support of the amendment, even with his plea to Congress saying they should pass it as a war measure, it failed its first vote in the Senate by just 2 votes.
Oh, wow. That must have been a huge blow.
Oh, it was crushing, but they just refused to give up.
That's incredible. What kept them going, facing all that opposition?
Well, their belief in their cause was unwavering, this commitment to equality and their solidarity with each other, that really fueled their determination. They knew they were fighting for something much bigger than themselves.
Makes sense. It's amazing what people can achieve when they come together like that.
Yeah.
So what changed things? How did they finally overcome this seemingly impossible obstacle?
Well, sometimes you just get lucky with the way politics shift, I guess you could say. The 1918 midterm elections turned out to be a major turning point for the movement.
Really?
Yeah. The Republicans, who were generally more supportive of suffrage, gained control of both houses of Congress.
Oh, wow. So that significantly increased the chances of the amendment actually passing. So did they take action right away?
They did. Just a few months after the election, in June 1919, the Senate finally passed the 19th Amendment.
Can you imagine the feeling in that room?
Oh, the jubilation, the relief. After all those years of struggle.
Absolutely incredible. But like you said before, this wasn't the end of the story, right?
Right. It still needed to be ratified by at least 36 states to become part of the Constitution. And that ratification process, well, that was a whole other dramatic saga.
Is that right?
Yeah, intense lobbying, heated debates, even some political maneuvering that'll make your head spin.
Wow, I can only imagine. Where did things get the most heated?
Well, by the summer of 1920, they were so close. 35 states had ratified. They just needed one more. And that's where Tennessee comes in. And things get really wild.
Tennessee. What made that state the final battleground?
Tennessee was just deeply divided on the issue. You had the rural areas, often influenced by those conservative religious leaders that were very much against it. And then the urban areas, with their more progressive outlook, pushing for ratification. It was like a mini version of the whole national debate.
So Tennessee became the ultimate showdown. What was it like there?
The podcast does a great job describing the scene at the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville. It basically turned into Suffrage Central.
I bet.
Lobbyists from both sides descended on the city, using every tactic imaginable to try and sway those state legislators. It was chaotic, intense pressure, backroom deals, rumors of bribes, intimidation tactics.
Oh, that's intense. So how did it all play out in Tennessee? Did you get that crucial 36th state?
Oh, it was a roller coaster, believe me. The Tennessee Senate, they actually voted to ratify pretty easily, which gave the suffragists hope.
Yeah.
But the House of Representatives, that was a whole different story. That's where the fate of the 19th Amendment really hung in the balance.
So the House was more resistant to the idea of women voting.
They were really divided, reflecting the split in the state as a whole. The Speaker of the House, a guy named Seth Walker, he was thought to be pro-suffrage at first,
Okay.
but then switched sides at the last minute, became a fierce opponent of the amendment.
What? Seriously? Why?
The podcast suggests corporate influence might have played a role.
Those powerful business interests again.
They didn't just sit back and watch, They poured money and resources into defeating the amendment, targeting key legislators like Speaker Walker.
It's crazy how much power money can have, even in something like this. So with the Speaker against them, did the amendment stand a chance?
It was a close one, really close. Walker and his anti-suffrage faction, they tried to table the amendment, which would have basically killed it, prevented any further votes.
I can't imagine how tense that must have been.
I know, right?
So what happened?
The vote ended in a tie.
You're kidding.
Nope. The amendment barely survived. But it still wasn't over. Everything came down to the final vote. Ratify or reject. Rejecting it could have set women's suffrage back years, maybe even decades.
Wow. It all came down to this one vote. It must have felt like the whole country was watching.
I'm sure it did.
So tell me, how did that final vote go down?
Well, it was like something out of a movie, full of twists and turns. There was this young representative, Harry Byrne, just 24 years old. He was considered a reliable vote for suffrage.
Oh.
But as they started the roll call, he hesitated. You could feel the anxiety among the suffragists.
Why was he hesitating?
He was getting pressured from both sides, intensely. Threats, promises, you name it. It was a lot for someone so young to handle. He seemed genuinely torn.
It's easy to forget that these are real people making these decisions, not just names in a history book. So what made him decide? What made him cast that final vote?
Well, it seems like his mom gave him some good advice.
His mom?
Yeah, the podcast mentions that he got a letter from his mother that morning, Phoebe Ensminger-Boren, a strong supporter of suffrage. She urged her son to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification.
Wow, that's amazing. Sometimes all it takes is a little motherly wisdom. So did he listen to her? Did he vote for suffrage?
He did. In a moment that would make him famous, Harry Byrne changed his vote to "I," securing ratification in Tennessee by a single vote, a victory decades in the making, won through strategy, persistence, and maybe a little bit of mom's advice.
That's an incredible story. So after all that, all those years of fighting, what happened next? Did the rest of the country celebrate?
They did, but it wasn't, everyone. It wasn't a universal celebration.
Yeah, I can imagine.
While a lot of people were obviously thrilled about this victory, for women's rights, others, they saw it with a lot of skepticism, even hostility. Got to remember, this was a time of massive social change. Not everyone was on board with the idea of women having a voice in politics.
Yeah, totally understandable. But officially, with Tennessee's ratification, the 19th Amendment was part of the Constitution.
Right. It was.
Yeah.
August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially certified, granting millions of women the right to vote.
It's hard to even imagine how that must have felt for them after all those years of struggle.
I know, it's incredible, isn't it?
All those marches, speeches, hunger strikes.
Yeah.
It finally led to this.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that this wasn't the end of the story. What challenges remained even after the 19th Amendment was ratified?
Well, passing the amendment was huge, obviously, but it didn't just magically make all the discrimination disappear.
Right.
It didn't guarantee that all women would have equal access to voting. The struggle, especially for women of color, was far from over.
So even though they had the legal right to vote, there were still obstacles in their way, especially for Black women.
That's right. In many parts of the country, especially in the South, Jim Crow laws and racist practices were still really strong.
Lord.
So Black women, despite having the right to vote on paper, often faced intimidation, violence, all sorts of voter suppression tactics.
Wow.
All designed to keep them away from the polls.
It's awful that even after the 19th Amendment, they were still facing all these hurdles.
It was a different kind of fight,
Yeah.
The fight for voting rights became intertwined with the fight for racial equality.
Makes sense. So what kind of tactics were used to prevent Black women from voting?
Oh, all sorts of things. Poll taxes, where you had to pay a fee to vote. Literacy tests that were designed to be almost impossible to pass. And even these grandfather clauses, which exempted white voters from all those restrictions.
That's outrageous.
It was a deliberate attempt to silence Black voices.
It sounds like the fight for true voting equality was just beginning.
In a way, it was.
So even with this huge victory, it's a reminder that the fight for equality continues.
Absolutely.
The suffrage movement really exposed those deep inequalities in American society.
It did.
And it shows how interconnected these social justice movements are. The fight for women's suffrage wasn't just about voting, right? It was about equality, representation, the right to participate fully in American democracy.
Right.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
It rarely is.
And even after these big victories, we need to stay vigilant. Keep fighting to protect those rights for everyone.
I agree.
It's been so fascinating learning about this. The whole suffrage movement is so much more complex than I realized.
It really is.
All the different personalities, the strategies, the setbacks, the long road to even partial victory.
It's a reminder that the fight for voting rights, it never really ends.
That's a good point. It's an ongoing process.
It is.
We need to be engaged, make sure those rights are protected for everyone.
I agree.
So what stands out to you the most from all of this?
I think it's the realization that progress rarely happens without a fight, without setbacks, without people who are willing to challenge the status quo. The suffrage movement, it reminds us that change requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to fight for what's right, even when it seems impossible.
I love that. That's a message that goes way beyond this one historical event.
Yeah.
It's about equality, justice, a more inclusive democracy.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
And we all have a role to play in it.
That's a great way to put it. It's been amazing diving deep into this with you.
It has.
And to everyone listening out there, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those letters coming to your representatives. Because every voice matters.
It really does.
Every action, no matter how small, can make a difference.
Absolutely.
That's all for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.